Stay tuned for tonight's adventure with the Fat Man.
Okay, here we go. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time of day it is. I hope it's good to be where you are because I'm really excited to be here today. My name is Baltimore Fats and I've been departmentalized. Yeah! All right, have fun, guys. All right, so this is Alexander Turney Stewart. Have you ever heard of this guy? This guy was king of the dry goods salesman. King because he turns the modest dry good venture that he opens in 1823 into a realm-wide retail empire with territories as far east as Germany that I know about. A retail empire that leaves him one of the 20 wealthiest people in history. And when I read that, I was like, wait a minute, what? One of the 20 wealthiest people in history? How come I've never heard of this guy before? And with all the attention that the Rockefellers, the Rothschilds, the Morgans, the Peabodys, with all the attention that they get, don't you think $90 billion buys you a seat at this table? Of course it does. It does in Mud City anyway. And so given his wealth and retail interests, King Alexander most certainly had his say. How could he not? Right? Because in Mud City, the earliest department stores, like Stewart's, are ground zero for consumer culture. The mother goddess of all the other distraction cultures and appetites being cooked up by our friends at the Peabody Institute. As part of the Royal Society's directive to improve natural knowledge and extend the empire. And so there's more about the department stores coming. But Falcon's maze for the story of the department store starts with our boy Alexander Stewart, king of the dry goods salesman. Because if there was ever a mainstream historical narrative that stinks, the story of Alexander Turney Stewart is it. Just poking around the googly approved articles, it became clear that his narrative is as incomplete as this pencil sketch of him. For starters, all these articles read like they were cut and pasted from a singular source, and so nothing feels right about his story to me. For being one of the 20 wealthiest people in history, he left a very small footprint. And in Mud City, you don't become one of the 20 wealthiest people in history by accident. Right? So who the fuck is he really? With none of these sources mentioning his parents' names, it felt like impossible to learn anything about him. But seeing his level of success and a relatively lacking historical presence, my fat senses went right to, well, he's a bloodline Stewart. Right? He has to be. With no family to trace back, it just makes sense. So with no family to trace back, it was time to pull the string and see what I could dig up.
Pull the string!
And what I found brought the story of Alexander Stewart, king of the dry goods salesman, right into the heart of Mud City. And it all starts with how different the mainstream narrative is from his obituary. And so I'm not going to do a full biography on Alexander Stewart here, but I do recommend reading his wiki. But I am going to highlight just a few of the instances that the stories differ. Right? The modern gatekeepers say that he was born in Lisburn, but his obituary says that he was born in Belfast. The modern gatekeepers say that he was just 3 weeks old when his father died, but the obituary says that he was 3 years old. So when did years become weeks? And even crazier, in a spoiler alert, there's reference to his father having died before he was even born. So there's nothing conspicuous about 3 different death dates for Alexander's father. Nothing at all, right? The gatekeepers tell us that Alexander was 12 or 13 years old when his grandfather dies. But the obituary says that he was 16, right? And there are so many of these types of inconsistencies between the modern mainstream narrative and this obituary. And so, as always, my questions are, who's getting these details wrong and why? Because if the story of Alexander Stewart, king of the dry goods salesman, is legit, then details like these should be consistent. Why are they so different? What sources were these writers using if not his obituary? And the more I thought about it, the stranger Alexander Stewart's story became. 2 years after his father dies, his nameless mother, even the obituary doesn't name his parents, but 2 years after her husband dies, she remarries and moves to America, leaving the future retail king in the care of her father, John Turney, who I found out was a very successful farmer. And he ensures that Alexander is educated and well raised. And when he dies, care for Alexander falls to one Thomas Lamb, an Irish Quaker. Of course, you gotta have Quakers in this story. And Thomas Lamb puts him to work before sending him off to New York, presumably by himself, to reunite with dear old mom. And he has $500 cash in his pocket, cash that he earned as a bag boy in 1818. In 1818, $500 is equivalent to almost $12,500 today. Can you imagine a well-educated but naive to the world 15-year-old boy on a 6-week transatlantic voyage with 12 grand in his pocket? First whiff of his privilege and money, pirates and conmen would have descended all over this kid. Unless he was chaperoned or otherwise protected. And that's just the way I'm seeing it, right? And so once again, it's around the money that the flags really begin to fly because once he gets to New York, he lands a cushy job tutoring rich kids, earning $300 a year, which is a pretty good salary in 1818. But who knew being a bag boy in Ireland was so much more lucrative a career? Like, he took a 40% pay cut to move to America. Who does that? And he turns the modest 12.5 by 30-foot dry goods store that he opens into a realm-wide empire that leaves him one of the 20 wealthiest people in history. And along the way, he opens the first superstore in 1846, which is dubbed the Marble Palace. And within 15 years or so, the store moves to the much larger Iron Palace building, which Natch burns to the ground. Right? And wouldn't you know it, he also lived in one of those old world style McMansions that he had built for himself. And don't you worry, right? He was a railroad baron too, with the Central Railroad running from a brickyard in Old Bethpage to Babylon, right? There's nothing coded in this story at all. He had churches like this one built as well, right? He was very rich. I needed to know more about this guy, but since I didn't have the names of his parents, the next string for me to pull was his wife, Cornelia. And unbelievably, it's with her family, and maybe not so much with King Alexander's business acumen, that we can see how a retail empire might be built out of New York in the mid-1800s, because her father, James Clinch, was one of, if not the, biggest ship's chandler at the Port of New York. And a ship's chandler was a retailer who dealt in boating and shipping supplies. And so, as the biggest dealer on the docks, he would have known what was going on at the Port of New York, information that could be very beneficial to the right dry goods salesman, like the one married to his daughter. And this idea is bolstered by the fact that her brother, Charles P. Clinch, becomes an inspector in the New York Customs House in 1838, a position he holds for 38 years, a career that reaches its peak when he briefly serves as acting collector of the Port of New York, which is the most lucrative position in the federal government at this time. How valuable do you think information on federal seizures and cargo forfeitures might be to the right dry goods salesman? Like the one married to your sister. Why, with this type of information, you might be able to create a realm-wide retail empire, because the dry goods business in America ran out of New York, as evidenced by these ads in an 1858 edition of the Baltimore Sun. And so in this scenario, Chucky P. Clinch would have had the port on lockdown like he was Al Swearingen or Tony Soprano or something, right? And so being married into the Clinches would have been very convenient and beneficial for young Alexander Stewart, who goes on to be so beloved that the New York Times dedicates 6 long columns on its front page to his obituary the day after he dies. An obituary they subtitle The Merchant Prince, so reinforcing my idea that he could be a noble or royal Stewart. If it takes one man 10 hours to fill a long column with typeset, how many teams of men did the New York Times have working to get this massive template ready for press? Because Alexander Stewart died at 1:50 in the afternoon the day before. Who was responsible for getting the copy ready? This is a massive undertaking, and it's like a day's worth of reading. How were they able to get it ready? Because in the text itself, the Times says that King Alexander made an imperative wish that news of his ill health be withheld from his friends and the public. So no needless anxiety would be occasioned, right? Because King Alexander thought that the general public would freak if they knew that he was sick and dying. And so now this means one of 3 things to me, right? Either he was betrayed by someone in his inner circle and this information was leaked, giving the Times and its editors plenty of opportunity to get this template prepped, or he died sometime before April 10th, and this date was chosen as his listed death date for some other reason. Or this story is complete bullshit, and Alexander Stewart is another one of Mud City's ghosts in the machine, a figment of the gatekeeper's imagination used to cover up the story of the department store and the $90 billion that went up in smoke after his death. But I'm getting ahead of myself here, right? More on that later, because now it's time to get all paradigm puzzle tree with it. While I was digging around the Clinches, I learned that Clinch is one of those location type surnames, and it means from the low hill. And you remember what a low hill is, don't you? Well, that's right. It's a hide by another name. So could the Clinches and the Hydes be the same family with different names? It certainly could be because they both can be found in the same place. You guessed it, in Wiltshire. The name Clinch is first found in Wiltshire.
What?
Which is amazing, right? So who doesn't come from Wiltshire these days? Unless, of course, they come from Sherwood Forest. Wait a minute, what's that you say? There was a Hugh Clinch in Lincolnshire in 1223, just a stone's throw from the Disneys and the Byrons and the Poes?
Yup.
Right, and to tighten it up even further, Chucky P's middle name? It's Powell, as in the firm Howell, Powell, and Poe. These Wiltshire and Lincolnshire locations are enough to connect the Clinches to Baltimore. And we're not done yet. In fact, we're just getting started. Right, so moving away from the Clinches, the gatekeepers were kind enough to give me a John Turney size string to pull.
Pull the string.
And so Turney is a Norman name. And they've set up shop in Shropshire by 1086. Right? And they were in Lincolnshire too, perhaps clinching it up with the Clinches and the Disneys. And not to be left out, the Turneys were in Wiltshire as well, right? Because, of course, they were in Wiltshire. So now this connects the Turneys not only to the Arundels and the Touches and the Hydes and all the other Wiltshire madness. This connects the Turneys and the Clinches to two different locations, and it could indicate a familial connection between them going back 1,000 years. And this opens up the possibility that the marriage between Alexander Stewart and Cornelia Clinch could have been an arranged marriage, and the inheritance money from his grandfather and the fine Irish linens that he buys and brings with him back to New York to open his dry goods store now read like a buy-in to the Clinch's dry goods scheme, using young Alexander as a front for their criminal enterprises along the docks of the port of New York. And if my fat senses got all in a tizzy over these Turney connections, they were about to lose their shit because, yes, Virginia, the Turneys were there too. When on July 8th, 1651, we have a Richard Turney receiving 2,009 acres of land, abutting southerly upon the Potomac River, commonly known by the name Dog's Island. And Dick Turney is given this land in exchange for transporting 42 persons into the colonies. And unfortunately, there isn't a full passenger list. But the record does show that Dick Turney was a slave runner at worst, because among the 42 passengers were Manuel and Joan the Negroes. But he also brings unto these shores one Sion the Turk, who was released from service as a free man in January of 1655, less than 4 years after his arrival in the colonies. Sion is free to move about the country. And I read that name and I was like, wait a minute, what? just that there's now a character named Sion the Turk roaming around Mud City is amazing enough. But what, if anything, could it mean? And unfortunately, this is everything that I could learn about Sion the Turk from the gatekeepers, who apparently didn't see me coming on this one. Just because the gatekeepers had nothing to say about him didn't mean I wasn't going to try to find out more. And so just to take his name literally suggests that he was from Turkey. And Turkey has huge Mud City implications. Noah's Ark allegedly came to rest on Mount Ararat in Turkey. And what is Mud City if not the story of how a realm can be rebuilt after a flood of biblical proportions? Big Mama and Çatalhöyük are in Turkey, as is the Temple of Ephesus, which of course was just a temple to our girl Artemis/Diana. A temple which was represented at the Mrs. Jarley's waxwork party of 1872 by Miss Sally White-Carroll. But maybe most telling of all is that in 1651, Turkey was the heart of the Islamic Ottoman Empire, which controlled pretty much everything we in the West think of as the ancient world. Greece, Egypt, Iran, Iraq, parts of Saudi Arabia, and of course, Israel. And so the name Sion the Turk could literally translate to the Israeli Turk, or the Turk from Israel, because Sion is just a transliteration of Zion with a Z, or this place. And this gets even better because Sion is also a Welsh given name. So he could be the Welsh Turk, or the Turkish Welshman. Given the role that Welsh noble families have played in Mud City, this name could signify some collusion between the noble families of England and the noble families of the Ottoman Empire during the plantation of the Chesapeake in the mid 1600s. It could also mean that maybe the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire was sending over spies of his own, agents doing spook work to further the Islamic cause. And an Ottoman presence in the Chesapeake in the mid 1600s could go a long way towards explaining how or why Fort McHenry points to Mecca. If anyone were smart enough to infiltrate England's colonies and mastermind a star fort that points to Mecca, it was Sultan Mehmed IV. Because check out the brain on Mehmed. Are you trying to tell me that he's not hiding a liter-sized cranium under that turban? You know he is. And to add another element to a possible collusion angle, Dog's Island, where Dick Turney receives his 2009 acres, is on the McHenry-Mecca alignment as well.
What?
And today, it's known as Mason Neck. Because of course it is. You can't throw a brick around here without hitting a mason. And this gets even better. Right? You see, in 1651, Dog's Island was home to a Native American tribe called the Doeg. And they were first observed and recorded by John Smith in 1608 in 4 locations along the Chesapeake. And 3 of those locations connect to this story. Because not only does Dog's Island line up, one of the other locations John Smith found the Doeg does as well.
Yup.
A place the Doeg called Pamakokek, a place we know today as Quantico.
What?
Are you kidding me? Quantico? Home to how much? Government and military intelligence? All of it? Quantico lines up with the Fort McHenry Mecca alignment too? How is that? It's not perfect, but it's close. And you have to remember that Google Earth is not an exact representation of our realm. In actuality, it could line up much better than this. And again, following the McHenry to Mecca alignment, look how close Fort McHenry comes to splitting these uprights. This is just unbelievable, right? I bet in a more precise alignment, McHenry does split these towers. It is incredibly crazy to me that half of John Smith's Doeg observations line up on the McHenry-Mecca alignment. It just blows my mind, right? And the third location that John Smith found the Doeg that impacts the story is a place that they called Yosokokomiko. And today, it's known as Powell's Creek, as in Howell, Powell, and Poe, right? You just cannot make this stuff up. It is just crazy to me that I can tie a Welsh-Israeli Turk to the Fort McHenry Mecca alignment just by trying to get a handle on who Alexander Turney Stewart really was. And now, of course, none of this proves anything, but it is fun to speculate about an Ottoman presence in Virginia and Maryland during the planting of the Chesapeake and its possible relationship to all of this. And believe it or not, we're not done yet. Not by a long shot, because it was after tracing down the Turney name and all of this madness that I found a proper biography for Alexander Stewart, king of the dry goods salesmen, appropriately enough called the Forgotten Merchant Prince, right? So more unprovable support for King Alexander being literal royalty. And it's this biography that appears to be the source material for all of these other articles, which is interesting because it wasn't published until 1992, well over 100 years after his subject's death. And unfortunately, it's not an easy book to come by. But by the grace of Yaldabaoth, praise Yaldabaoth, most of the first chapter is available on Amazon. Just enough to blow this story wide open, because the author gives up King Alexander's parents' names. And in a surprising turn of events, Alexander Stewart's father's name was Alexander Stewart, and he held land at Red Hill. And I have to wonder if Red Hill was a low hill, making this Alexander Stewart a Hyde or a Clinch by another name. But regardless, yeah, that's whole other speculation, right? King Alexander's mother's name was Margaret, daughter of the aforementioned John Turney, and her father's wealth made her a very attractive bride in waiting, as she had many suitors.
Hey, are you the whore who bangs everybody?
And I think it's interesting that she gives up her favored beau to marry Alexander Stewart Sr., who apparently met her father's approval and had a farm nearby. But unfortunately, even learning King Alexander's parents' names did not help me bring the family back any further. But when one door closes, another one opens, because the author does give me another string to pull in the form of the Marquis of Hereford.
Pull the string!
And the Marquis of Hereford was an English nobleman whose family owned significant land in Ireland and politically represented King Alexander's hometown of Lisburn in Parliament. So Lisburn, where King Alexander was born, was the Marquis of Hereford's land. And John Turney and Alexander Stewart Sr. were his boys. And when King Alexander was born, the title of the Marquis of Hereford was held by Francis Ingram Seymour Conway, second Marquis of Hereford. And he was a bigwig who was royal chamberlain to Kings George III and IV, and his ties to royalty go much deeper than the Hanovers. His grandfather, 7 times removed, is none other than Edward Seymour, 1st Duke of Somerset, builder of Somerset House, and who seems to enjoy popping up all over the place these days. And this Seymour family strikes very deep, especially in Wiltshire, where more than one Seymour served as sheriff of Wiltshire out of Wolf Hall, wolfing it up with the Hydes and the Clinches and the Touches and the Arundels, and perhaps maybe even connecting this to Aethelwulf's ring and the juice and all of that, right? It's just unbelievable. And so it turns out that the name Seymour is really Saint Maur or Saint Maur, and it's French. And if you bring my favorite genie back far enough, the Saint Maur line dead ends with Hugh de Sainte-Maurie. And I love how unassuming this genie page is, because Hugh de Sainte-Maurie is the patriarch of the Capet ruling dynasty of France, and the Capets rule France for over 900 uninterrupted years, right up until Marie Tussaud spirits the last of them out of France after having helped stage their executions. And Hugh here has a bloodline connection to Charlemagne, but it is just insane that a simple rooting around Alexander Stewart, king of the dry goods salesmen, would lead me to Charlemagne via his parents who lived on Seymour land in Ireland. And to further tighten the possible royal blood that courses through King Alexander's vein, I speculate that Alexander Stewart Sr. was not King Alexander's biological father at all. And that honor should fall to Francis Seymour Conway, 3rd Marquis of Hereford, who in 1803, when King Alexander was born, he would have been in his mid-20s and in Lisburn, making him a prime candidate to be one of handsome Margaret's many suitors, maybe even the favored beau she gave up to marry Alexander Sr. And so now this marriage is reading more like a cover story for the illegitimate child of Francis Conway's that Margaret Turney was carrying. This could go a long way towards explaining King Alexander's comfortable upbringing and unparalleled success, and it would also give him a bloodline that connects all the way back to Charlemagne. And if there were a smoking gun that could prove such a family connection between the two, it just may be the only other book about Alexander Stewart that I could find. A book about his art collection. Apparently, King Alexander loved himself some art and had the biggest and best collection of paintings in the colonies. In the States. And this is important because Francis Conway also loved himself some art, and most of his collection is preserved to this day. And that the 3rd Marquis had other children who were also art collectors backs this up. That King Alexander loved art so much is a clear sign to my fat senses that he felt some sort of connection to the 3rd Marquis. And the 3rd Marquis, being his true father, could also explain away the inconsistencies regarding Alexander Sr.'s untimely death. I don't know, but this makes sense to me. And we're not done yet. Hugh de Sainte-Maurie, he marries one Adelaide of Aquitaine, who was the granddaughter of the Duke of Normandy, Rollo, the same Rollo that Sturla Ellingwag and company tried to genetically link to Queen Elizabeth II, the story that jump-started the Norse code. And so if the 3rd Marquis of Hereford were King Alexander's biological father, that would mean that the king of the dry goods salesmen could be related to this guy. And so when I started this little investigation, I never expected it to end here, or to go back quite so far, because there are at least 3 pieces of evidence the modern gatekeepers give us that point to Alexander Stewart having never existed at all, that he really is a ghost in the machine. And so Exhibit A would have to be the case of the 26 boxes of letters that were addressed to Alexander Stewart that some mysterious stranger sells to the New York Library's Rare Book and Manuscript Division. And this was in 1935, almost 65 years after his death. And in these boxes were thousands of letters written to Alexander Stewart as if he were Santa Claus or Jesus Christ or something. People pouring their hearts out, begging for money or work or some even just asking for his autograph. But the crazy thing is, among all of these thousands of letters, there's no evidence that he either read or replied to any of them. And so there's nothing suspect about this story at all, especially when you factor in that Alexander Stewart left no legacy. Right? He and Cornelia had 3 children that didn't make it to adulthood. And you know what that means in Mud City. So he has no issue. And after his death, his wife Cornelia sells the business, burns through a bunch of cash, and then dies roughly 10 years later in 1886. What's left of the estate is liquidated, and Alexander and Cornelia Stewart fade into obscurity. Right? So where did these letters come from? Who held on to them for 50 years or more, only to unload them on the New York Library? These letters couldn't have been planted at the New York Library to support the fake story of Alexander Stewart at all, right? No, right? Because I have to ask myself, where is all the other correspondence he would have had with his agents abroad, his rich friends? And all these people did was write letters, and they loved to keep them. And so I'm sure there must be some other correspondence of his out there that the gatekeepers just aren't making easy to find. But the story of these letters stinks. But not as bad as the decaying flesh that is Exhibit B. Right? Unbelievably, 2 years after his death, his body is stolen from its grave and held for ransom.
What?
Which is allegedly paid by Cornelia and remains are returned. But the police believe Cornelia was duped and that she's interred another man's body in her husband's new tomb in Garden City. And so this would mean that there is no physical proof that Alexander Stewart ever existed. This would make any genetic testing impossible.
How convenient.
And so last but not least is Exhibit C, the cherry on top of this episode, and that's his photograph. This, apparently, is the only known photograph of Alexander Stewart, king of the dry goods salesmen. And while playing with the idea that he was the illegitimate child of Francis Seymour Conway, 3rd Marquis of Hereford, I thought it would be fun to put the 2 men next to each other and see what I could see. And so there's not much there, perhaps a little smoke over the shape of the dome, maybe a little bit here in the nose, but certainly this is nothing definitive, nothing screams father and son about these 2 images, but that doesn't really matter because who knows if this is even really Francis Seymour Conway? I don't. But the more I looked at this picture, the more I thought, well, if this is Alexander Stewart, king of the dry goods salesmen, well then who in the hell is this? Because this guy and this guy are not the same guy. And the differences are glaring, from the shape of the head to the nose to the ears to the hairline. This is not the same person. So what is going on here? I think someone didn't get the memo about taking this photo out of circulation, because none of the gatekeeping articles I read used this image, only this one. And so now this photograph plays out the way Mud City likes them, that whoever this is just a wino off the street that they cleaned up and slapped a tux on, took the picture, gave him a buck and some booze, and sent him on his way. But regardless, none of this is a good look for the legitimacy of King Alexander's story. And so, all right, that's all I have for this one. But there's more to come on King Alexander and the department store. So be sure to stay tuned for the next Blue Light special of an episode. Remember, guys, just because you don't know the truth doesn't mean you can't have fun with the lies, right? So until the next one, cheers.